Are you someone who thinks Linux is complicated? Think again, because I am here to tell you that by end of this series you will be using Linux like a pro. Welcome to StarAgile's exclusive Linux learning series. I am Himanshu, your trainer for this journey. With hands-on demos and practical examples, you will go from zero to Linux hero in no time. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. This is just the beginning. Let's dive into chapter 1 and start building your Linux expertise. In this video, we are going to talk about introduction of Linux and open source. So before understanding what Linux is, we should understand what an operating system is. An operating system is nothing but a layer of a software which basically uses for the users who wants to interact with the hardware. And open source means the software which is freely available in the market. So Linux is one of those which has a source code freely available in the market. So if we talk about an operating system is made up of 3 layers. Basically, there is a hardware, and on top of it there is a kernel, and on top of it there is a application software layer. So if we see that here, the kernel, what is kernel basically? If you think this ideology that a car which has a body is nothing but application software for any operating system, and the engine of the car, which is very important, without engine car cannot be driven. So that is what the kernel is. So Linux kernel is very important engine for the Linux operating system in order to communicate with the user and the hardware. So hardware does not understand our languages because hardware prefers to understand binary languages, 0101 bytes informations, right? But the user can use any of the languages, like it can use Java, it can use Python, it can use CLI mode, it can use GUI applications. So any software, any application a user understands which is visible on the user interface, but hardware does not directly understand this. So who will do that manipulation job for us? So this is where the kernel pitch in. Basically, a user who wants to communicate to the hardware needs a kernel who can manipulate what user is saying and make it understandable for the hardware. Similarly, hardware sends the response back to the kernel, and then kernel sends the response back to the user. That's how a user interacts with the hardware. So Linux is an open source operating system. Open source means the source code which was freely available in the market. Anybody can use that source code. So now you will be thinking about why should we use operating system, open source operating system? Why not we can use Windows or Mac OS, right? So the thing is, operating system which is open source available has a lot of features that can be leveraged by the user. For example, it has some customizable features which anybody can download and dump that open source source code of that operating system and then manipulates it with their own ease and then develop it. I'll talk about a little example. Let's say, for example, there is a house. You are constructing a house on a pure land. That house needs concrete, needs sand and stuff, right? And you can set up that house with your own ease. You can set up the privacy. For example, you want window here, you want gate here, you want lock here, this type of lock you want. So you can make it more securable rather than a house which is already being built by the builder and then give it to you, right? So that is a customizable, that feature of customization is available in the open source, which is not available in the closed source softwares, for example, Windows. So it gives us facilities like, security. If we talk about security, then it has a feature of reliability. Reliability means it can, whatever user is saying to the system, it understands, it impacts, it responds back to you for whatever the reason you are asking a system to do, right? So it's reliable. You can trust on it. You can trust on the results and responses what you're getting from the operating system. So that is how Linux is. Then it's customizable, that we have already talked about. So the open source code is customizable. You can download it, you can customize it, you can tweak it and then use it for your own operating system. And very important thing is, Linux is a lightweight operating system. It's a lightweight OS. What does it mean by lightweight? Lightweight means a limited set of softwares which are really needed in order to run any OS. So if we talk about containers and Dockers and very lightweight systems, which does not need a lot of layers of their softwares on top of it, just needs a pure engine which is the kernel and needs a basic application software which is required in order to communicate to the hardware. That is what Linux is built up of lightweight, and that's why it is famous in the market. So now, if we talk about the history of Linux, we should understand this, and you should see the kernel. If we talk about the kernel, so Linux kernel is freely and open source available in the market. You can see here, as I talked about that, current kernel of Linux is 6.13, which is the version of the kernel which is currently available in the market, and you can download the tarball of it, and then you can deploy it. You can build based on your ease, and then you can make it change. So Linux kernel is available on the kernel.org, and this is the GitHub for the Linus Torvalds, who has basically who is the inventor of Linux kernel, and this is his Git repository where you can see the various versions of the kernel available, and has the latest version which is 6.13. You see the commit, the last commit here, which was at 9 hours before. So that's an active one where you can download and see the latest changes which have been implemented in this kernel. And this is the GitHub for Linus Torvalds. You can just fork this, and people who understand GitHub, they can just fork this GitHub and then make the changes whatever they would want to, and then they can build their own OS on top of it. So that's, I wanted to showcase the open source, where is it available, where you can dump it and see things. So that's about the Linux kernel, and that's about the open source. Now we will proceed with the history of Linux, and we understand that what Linux is, how it was invented, who invented Linux, and how did it come into the market and became so famous. So if we talk about history of Linux, you see that initially the Linux was kind of got the appraisal in the market after this Unix came. So in 1969 and 70s time frame, in the Bell Labs, basically IBM's Bell Labs, so sorry, AT&T Bell Labs, that's where the engineers Cam Thompson and Dennis Ritchie, they were working on Unix. They built a operating system called Unix, which was not an open source operating system, which means that their source code was not freely available in the market. So after this, they went for another 10 years from 1970 to 1980s. That's where that operating system Unix, which was fairly using in the academics, institutions, in the government sectors and stuff. But then what happened is, after 1980s, there was a need of something called open source has to be come up, because those softwares are very heavy paid and very heavy licensing. Nobody with as a user cannot afford that one, right? Only the companies or the academics or the government organizations, they were getting offering for those softwares, and then getting the license for it, using it for their own systems. So in 1983, Dennis Ritchie, basically Richard Stallman basically started an organization called GNU. GNU means which is not Unix. They frame it like this, that this is not a Unix operating system. This is something which is freely available in the market. So what happened is, in 1985, he built something called Free Software Foundations, FSF. That's where they started building free softwares on which can be freely available to the market, to the people, they can use it. And then meanwhile, there is this student of University of Helsinki called Linus Torvalds. In 1991, he was in college, and he said that a statement called that I am working on a hobby project. A hobby project would be, I will be launching one Linux kernel. I'll be launching kernel of Linux, and then I'll be freely available to the market. So that's how it started, and in August 25, 1991, he launched the first version of Linux. That was in floppy disk, you can see here. So that was a floppy disk. He launched a root and boot disk both. That was a 0.02 version of the Linux, the first version of Linux, which was launched by Linus Torvalds. After that, this organization, GNU organizations, basically, they wanted everything to be publicly available, because they say it's a general public license which they built. So whatever happened after that, 1991, all the softwares, the community grouped together, and then they started making customization, started adding their own tools and softwares on top of what Linus Torvalds did. So if I talk about the early development of Linux from 1992 to 1995, under GNU, they built a lot of tools which they implemented in Linux, and then they started using that Linux. So the early version of Linus Torvald, what he launched basically was just doing the basic stuff through an hardware. It was not doing some complex operations. It was just doing the basic ones. Then in 1993 and 1995, the first time they launched the very first Linux operating system, which came, and I would say the first Debian, the first version which came was the Slackware. The first distribution which was released in 1993. After that, Debian came in 1993 as well. And after the Debian thing, there are a lot of branches we'll see that. A lot of branches of Debians, people started using forking those Debians, and then, after that, they used to build their own OS and then publish it. So that's how it happened. So in 1994, Red Hat was the organization who launched their operating system called Red Hat, which was built from Fedora. And then OpenSUSE was also launched around the similar line in 1994. Then we talk about 1996 to 2000. The development, the first version after that Linus Torvald gave was 0.02, and then the second version came 2.0, which was released in 1996. And that 1996 version has had some more capabilities to perform some of networking interface tools, and better projects to handle the stability and the security part. And HP, UX, and IBM and AT&T, they all kind of supporting Linux because they had to. Community was using it at a large scale. So in 1998, Netscope basically released their free open source browser, which was Mozilla Firefox. So Mozilla Firefox is also an example of an open source software, right? Which has a source code, and you can tweak it, you can change whatever the changes you would want to. So Netscope was the one who launched that software, and then so that phase till 2000, the Linux was kind of an CLI tool. Not a GUI, not a graphical, which was available to the user. So it was purely CLI. On CLI, they can you can run applications, you can run commands, whatever you would want to, and interact with the kernel. But there was a demand of the graphical user interface came into picture. Why did it come? Because they would wanted something for the user to be user friendly, so that operating system a user can use and perform things. Graphical UI, it's easy to use. So that's where they started developing the desktop version of Linux. So the first desktop version of Linux, which was launched in 2004, called Ubuntu. So Ubuntu was that Debian launch software, I would say the OS, which was having a user-friendly interface to interact with the hardware. So in 2010, Google launched Android operating system, which was built on the Linux under the hood. And parallelly, Docker and containers and that Kubernetes technology was also evolving at that time. So this kind of a thing changed the market. And then Amazon came into picture in 2011. They started building their own cloud platform, where they were using IaaS, SaaS, and PaaS, all three cloud platforms on the Amazon Linux. So which was also on the Linux platform. All their EC2 machines, all their servers were deployed in the Linux. So that's how the vast variety of resources which were used, including the Linux over the time. And then in 2011 as well, kernel 3.x released, which was a 20 years of anniversary of Linux starting 1991. And after that, in 2020, a lot of IoTs and supercomputers and artificial intelligence came into picture. They also started using Linux as a platform, and then Linux, Red Hat, and they started supporting ARM-based processors, which were deployed in 2021. ARM-based processors, we'll talk about those while in installation. We'll see the differences between the hardware of normal architecture and the ARM-based architecture. So Linux started supporting that as well, and then after that, they were using IoT devices under the hood Linux, and then so far across, if we talk about in the entire industry, So Linux was kind of 75% used. And if we talk about the cloud warehouses workloads, that was 90%. And if we talk about the web servers, that is 70%. So that is how the journey of Linux happened. If we recap it, we'll see initially since 1960 to 1970, when AT&T Bell Lab started building up the Unix. There was the initial part. After that, during 1971 to 80, BSD systems came. It was a Berkeley system devices. They started using for academics and the government organizations. After that, they had this requirement of having the open source softwares which will be freely available to the market. So Richard Stallman in 1983 started GNU project, and then after that 1991 Linus Torvalds releases the first version of Linux kernel, which was 0.02. And then 1992 to 1995 early development happened of Linux. In 1993 the Slackware, the first distribution of the Linux, was launched along with the Debians. Then 1994 Red Hat, SUSE, they all were launched. And 1996 to 1990 to 2000, adoption of Linux was too high that they launched the new kernel version of 2.0 in 1996. And in 2010 Google launched Android, and then Docker Technologies and AWS also started using Linux under the hood, and Kubernetes also started using Docker and container technologies which were using Linux under the hood. Then 2021 5.x kernel introduced, then IoT devices, and then we see the usage of Linux, power of Linux in the global environment. So 90% of cloud workload which are deployed in Linux, 100% which are deployed in supercomputers, and 70% which were deployed in web service. So this is the journey, this is the evolution of Linux which has happened over the period of time, and that's how people started adopting it and using it. So that's what we have so far talked about. Now we'll talk about the Linux distributions. There are various distributions which are available in the market. For example, Red Hat, OpenSUSE, Fedora, Ubuntu, Linux, Kali Linux, Mint Linux, and Slackware. So there are a lot of variety of distributions which are available. So we'll talk about Ubuntu here. So this is my machine where I have downloaded and installed Ubuntu. We will talk about that in our next chapter. So if you look at the release of Ubuntu which I am using right now is Ubuntu 24.04.01 LTS. So LTS is nothing but a long time support, which means Ubuntu gives you support for minimum 5 years, then you can extend it for 12 years and then 15 years. So till 15 years it will be supporting this version. So whatever the softwares will be coming up in the future will be supporting by this operating system is what it means. And parallelly, if you look at we talk about how do we get the source code, how to download that source code, how to dump that source code. So would want to show that as well. So there is a file called etc apt sources list.d. So this is the file where we see I have added all these repositories. These are nothing but the source code of the Debians. So Ubuntu is a Debian based distribution. We'll talk about that once we see that image. I'm coming up there. So these are the archives libraries which are available. So as soon as you add up there, and after that you have to just say sudo apt update. So this is basically to update the software, apt software, which will be using and downloading the packages. We'll talk about that once we will discuss the commands. And so you have to just get the source. So for getting the source, there is a command called sudo apt get sources source Linux. So this will be downloading the packages for you. Since I have already downloaded, you can see that it's skipped downloading. So I have downloaded in my local home directory here, and this is those differences file. You can see the origin of Linux. So this is nothing but the kernel version which I have downloaded, the latest available here. And if you look at the code of it, you can just see it. Just cd into Linux, and you can see drivers and kernel files and make files, and so that is nothing but the source code which is available. So you can just use this source code to build up your customization, and then on top of it you can deploy things. Now let's talk about the distribution which is started over the period of time, so we can see that here. So this is the Linux distribution timelines which is available on the Google. So if you type it and search the distribution history, you will find that image. So if you look at it, from 1992, they started forking the community editions of images, and then the first version of Linux, which was launched in 1990, somewhere around 1993, was Slackware. And then from Slackware, you can see there are a lot of branches coming up here. So various type of Linux which was built on top of Slackware. So how, if you talk about that, how people started using it. So basically, this source code is available on the GitHub, and anybody can fork that GitHub and then contribute to it. So that's how the community is basically using it. For example, why this is famous and why the open source is widely used is because the community, if we talk about the community across the world, there are a lot of users who are using this. So you can see the Linux distribution timelines over here, which started from 1992. So the first version of Linux, which was launched as a Slackware, and then after that people started forking that call, that branches, and then they started adding their points as well in the main branch of the Linux. So that's how they started it. After that, what happened is, with the time, people from the community side, they started adding their points in the branches, and then they started adding the code whatever they would want. And if you look at after Slackware, Debian was the one which was launched in somewhere around 1994. And from the Debian, if you look at the branches, mostly here, these are the variety of operating systems which were taken from the Debian. So Ubuntu is one of those. So you see here Kubuntu, and this branch is the Ubuntu branch, which was forked from the Debian branch. And from Ubuntu also, there were a lot of softwares, operating system which were taken further. Kubuntu is one of those. Go Ubuntu is there, Alto is there, Deft is there. So there are a lot of type of Ubuntu softwares, operating systems were built after that. So that's how they started, creating this Linux distribution. So with the community help, there were a lot of operating systems which was launched. And if you look at here, if you go a little down, Red Hat was launched, and after that from Red Hat, there was a lot of Linux operating system was built on top of it. Let's say Oracle Linux, which was also taken a fork from the the Red Hat branch. Then if you look at eSmith, if you look at Connectiva, or etc. And here Zurich, from that SUSE Linux was launched, and then from SUSE Linux there were a lot of branches which were open, and then OpenSUSE and SUSE Linux Enterprise Desktop version was launched after that. So this is kind of give us a variety of idea about how the Linux was developed over the period of time. So the community kept on adding. That's why the progression for the Linux software was too heavy and too high and too speedy as well. So with the time, they somewhere around thousands of softwares and operating systems which was launched post the first version of Linux kernel was launched in 1991. And so if we talk about the history, so somewhere around 2004 when Ubuntu was launched. After that, in early 2000, Red Hat was launched. And they all had like variety of features. Ubuntu had variety of features called Genome, which was nothing but a graphical version of displaying the Linux operating system. And then it has a variety of support for the desktops, servers, IoT devices, and etc. and etc. And if we talk about Red Hat, there are two versions of Red Hat which are available. If you want to use the free OS, you can use CentOS. If you want to use the enterprise version of Red Hat, so there is something called RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So earlier I was talking about open source, which means the source code is freely available in the market, it's open. But I could say that if you want the support for this, you have to pay for that. For example, you are purchasing a licensed version of operating system Linux, let's say from Red Hat, so Red Hat will charge only for that licensing part of their OS, which means in future, if you come across any of the issues while deploying the Linux on your machines, or data warehousing or connectivities or integrations and stuff, right? So you can contact Red Hat support. Red Hat support will give you complete support of it because you have purchased that license. So that is a paid version of Red Hat, and CentOS is the free version of Red Hat. So, and Red Hat was initially formed based on Fedora. Fedora was also a Linux, and then Red Hat was built on top of Fedora. Yeah, so mainly in market, if you look at the companies which are being famous and mainly being used, their OSs, Red Hat is one of those. The really big giant, company who basically sell their OS. Not just the OS, they do a lot of stuff, but yeah, the OS is primarily is when they started with. After that, if we talk about some other OSs, then we can talk about, we have already seen that Ubuntu is a Debian based, and then RHEL is the enterprise based. Then Fedora project was in 2003. After that, during that same time, SUSE was also come. We already seen that OpenSUSE and Red Hat, they were both launched somewhere around in mid 98 or that time frame. And there are some other Linuxes which were little famous and people use it. Arc Linux is one of those. So they released in 2002, and they have something called Pacman package manager, which was mainly used across industries. So they have some features called minimalistic designs and continuous updates, which they have been releasing so far. So that's why the Arc Linux was used. For the offensive security purpose, there was a mainly software was Kali Linux, which was launched in 2013, and this is also Debian based. So Kali Linux is the software which was mainly used for the hackers. I will talk about the white hat hackers. People who wanted to provide securities to the companies, they need vulnerabilities, scannings, and etc. So Kali Linux is the best software for it. So if you're looking this video and you would want to pursue your career in security and that domain, so you should explore Kali Linux as well. In our coming videos, we will talk about the installation of Linux. We will talk about mainly the Ubuntu part, because that is a user-friendly, easy to install, easy to access, easy to perform things. And then there was one more version or distribution of Linux, I would say, Linux Mint. That also has a quite nice OS graphical presentations where user basically can easily access the icons, and they can perform things with whatever they would want to perform with respect to their hardware. So Linux Mint is another one of it. It was launched in 2006. There are also quite nice desktop version of Mint was XFCE desktop. That was little famous, and then it used based on Cinnamon. So Cinnamon was another project which basically was launched for the interfaces. So Mint is nothing but it was deployed on top of by using the same technology what Cinnamon was using. So it also kind of look really nice in terms of interface wise. So you can Google it up, you can see how does a Cinnamon graphical UI looks like, how does a Mint UI look like. So those are nothing but the desktop versions of Linux which people might like it, and based on their use cases they use it. Then CentOS we have already talked about, and yeah, so that's all about the distribution of the Linux. All right, so let's review the comparison table. We have it here, which has a variety of operating systems, and it's basically give us an idea about which operating system, which distribution was based on which one, and then what kind of an audience it might prefer or attracts. If it is for beginners, or if it is for somebody who is looking for security domain, or if it's for somebody who wants to basically use the best graphical UI, then which one to prefer, or somebody who is hard coder and then would want to pursue only for who likes the CLI and prefers to perform the CLI actions like me. So you can go for Red Hat or any other operating systems. So if you look at Ubuntu was based on Debian. Beginners was the audience, which means the people who would want to start with Linux. They can adopt Ubuntu, and then they can play around with it. The use cases I have explained already, that it has a good desktop. It can be used as a server as well, or on the cloud machines as well, and it's user friendly. It gets extensive support. You can get the free support for Ubuntu, whatever the support you would want. If you seek for it, you can just go to Google it and then go for Ubuntu site. You will get the support from the Ubuntu side, or on the Stack Overflow also you will get whatever the queries you have for Ubuntu. First, RHEL was based on Fedora. It's an enterprise audience which pay the license for Red Hat, and then they would want to use it for their company. Use cases are basically the mission critical systems which should not go down, should be up and running. For example, if I say we talk about Flipkart, we talk about Amazon, when they launch the big billion days sales, at the time the systems are always up and running, right? So which means they have some sort of a technology which is adopt under the hood, so that their system should not go down. It could include various load balancers, it could include various operating systems, data warehousing, connectivities and stuff. But under the hood, if we talk about the compute power on top of which they are deploying it, that OS is nothing but a RHEL is what they are preferably using. They are getting enterprise support from Red Hat, and then whenever they get stuck with things or integration issues, they can seek for Red Hat support. So it's for the enterprise audience. CentOS is the RHEL based, which is a free version of Red Hat. As whatever the Red Hat gives is what the CentOS gives. The same user interface, you can see the same experience, you will find it in CentOS as well. It's just that it's a free version of Red Hat, you can say. Then Debians are the distributions. It's independent distribution because Debian itself was launched back in 1993, the time frame. So it was a standalone individual distributions from which a lot of branches occurred after that, and then people started using and adding up their points in the community wise, right? So Debian gives a good servers and desktops, and basically they are good for stabilities and robustness. Similarly, Fedora is also independent, launched by the developers, and it's basically using the cutting edge development technologies for which Fedora was famous, and that's how Red Hat adopt Fedora in order to make the modifications on top of it. Then there was some other OS called SLES, which was mainly used for the SAP clouds. The people who are using into SAPs, they prefer to use SLES OS. And then Arch Linux, we have already talked about the rolling releases and minimizations it uses, basically the custom systems. Kali Linux is basically for security enthusiastic people who would want to pursue, or who would want to good for do something good in terms of security domain. They would want to prefer Kali Linux, and they can use it for their expertise. Mint is basically, again, it's based on Cinnamon, and then it's Ubuntu was the initial version of Mint. On top of it, it was developed. It also gives you the desktop based use cases, and then it also has a UI kind of which kind of attracts to the people, and then they use their use cases based on they have it. So that's about the comparison table we have. Next, we'll pursue the installation of Linux. We'll talk about what kind of Linux and how to install it, what are the ways to install it. So we'll discuss that. That's a wrap for Introduction to Linux and Open Source. But don't stop here. We have got plenty more episodes coming up in this series. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss the next episode. We'll be talking about the installation of Linux. Got questions? Drop them in the comments and I'll be happy to help.